All right, and I'm going to change the view. And now we can get started. So we are on chapter 1, verse 1 of the book of Deuteronomy. And if you have the Eitz Chaim Chumash, page 981. 981. I'll give you a minute to find it. And if you have any Chumash, this is one point where it's very easy to find the place. Just open to the book of Deuteronomy and you are there. And so we're going to see immediately a kind of introduction which is very different from anything that we've seen. Because this book is very different than any other book in the Torah. In the past, we've heard the voice of a narrator, right? So someone will be saying, and God said to Moses the following words, or Moses said the following words. What we're going to hear now is a speech by Moses. And in fact, in a sense, the entire book of Deuteronomy is a speech by Moses. Now, it's hard to say whether this speech was given all at once, Moses gathering all the people together and giving this long oration, or whether it was really over a period of time, as he would gather them successively to deliver one piece or another. As someone who gives speeches, used to give them for a living, I want to suggest to you that it's much more likely that the book of Deuteronomy was spoken by Moses over time. People, it used to be that people had more Sitzfleisch than they do today. But I want to ask everybody, please, to mute, just in case, if you're not, please mute. But, so rabbis used to speak, I don't know, 45, 50 minutes sometime back in the old days. Today, they speak around 15, 20, 25 minutes. But the idea that someone would stand up before the people and speak for hours seems less likely than that these messages are delivered over time. Anyway, the opening words now of the book of Deuteronomy is a kind of preamble. Elu hadvarim asher diber Moshe. These are the divarim that Moses addressed to the people of Israel. So the word divarim literally means things. These are the things that Moses told the people. But it also means words. These are Moses's words. So again, this preamble is telling us that Moses actually now is responsible for the book of Deuteronomy. There's an interesting midrash, and now I remind you of what I said last time, that there are different methods of interpretation. The pshat, the simple meaning, is one, and another is drash or midrash. And what midrash does is to take something in the text and reread it in a way that could give us a new meaning. It's not that the midrash is claiming that that's the word in the text. It's as though we dig out, and lidrosh means to dig out. We're able to dig out something else. So elu ha-devarim could also refer to through a kind of pun, right? Divarim could be divarim, or like devora, right? Like bee, right? These are the bees that Moses delivered. Now, that's a very odd interpretation, but the idea here is that Moses's words sting like a bee sting. Moses is going to chastise the people. His words are going to be very harsh. The commentary in Eitz Chaim, if you look at the bottom of the page, says something I think is really quite beautiful. A bee's sting hurts the person stung, but it hurts the bee more, causing his death. And that gives us a sense that behind this midrash is the sense that these are the last words that Moses will speak to the people, that Moses is preparing to die. This is his deathbed speech, not that he's lying ill, because when Moses dies, God will simply take his soul. He won't go through illness. He will die in full command of all of his faculties. Right? There is something called an ethical will. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this idea. It in previous generations of the Jewish people, and going back even to the Middle Ages, people would write an ethical will. This was a document which was composed for their heirs, their children, their grandchildren. And it's about what they want them to know and to remember. And this is not a memoir. It's not, an ethical will is not where someone says, you know, my parents were like this, and I was born in this place, and I did this kind of work. That's not an ethical will. An ethical will is a kind of charge to the next generation. You know, it was things like, you better marry someone Jewish. That was a kind, you'd find something like that in an ethical will, or, you know, be sure to give tzedakah, or whatever it is. In other words, it's ethics, right? And this is a kind of an ethical will. You can look at it that way, as Moses wants to deliver this message to a group of people who are, in a sense, like his children, because he's led them like a parent. Well, more accurately, of course, God has led them by a parent, but Moses was God's representative there doing the work. One last thing about this second word of the text. These are the devarim, the words that Moses spoke. So devarim is an interesting word because it reminds us of something that happens at the very beginning of the book of Exodus. God brings Moses to the burning bush and delivers a message. He says, I want you to go back to Egypt, because Moses, of course, was born there and ran away. I want you to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let the people go. And Moses says, send somebody else. I'm not the right guy. And he says, Lo ish devarim anochi. I am not a man of devarim. I'm not a good speaker. I'm not eloquent. Right? That's what Moses says to God back at the burning bush. And here, at the end of his career, right, that's the beginning, at the end of his career, he is a man who speaks words and eloquent. What we find here is, in a lot of places, very poetic. Right? He's a man who can deliver a speech that is going to go on for, I'm just curious, about 33 chapters. He's certainly a man of words. And so this idea of words is a kind of, is an envelope around which the Torah takes place, from a man who isn't a man of words, to a man who is. Okay, so these are the words that Moses spoke. And where did he speak them? Asher diber Moshe el kol bnei Yisrael. I should mention that, to the entire Jewish people, right? Everybody. The idea here is that there is a gathering, a huge gathering. Remember, there are hundreds of thousands of people, and how this exactly worked is unclear. presumably people are relaying the message. At least the conceit there is the people are gathered before him, and where are they? Be'ever HaYarden, on the other side of the Jordan. All right, so Moses is there on the other side of the Jordan. This is just as they're ready to enter the promised land. And then we get a list of places, which is through the wilderness, in the Arava, near Suf, between Param and Tophel, Lebanon, Hatzerot, Di Zahav. Right? What we're seeing here is a kind of recounting of places, and it goes from north to south, right? And there is a sense in which he is summing up now all of the things that happened at all of these places. And I'm sorry, I didn't even finish it, which is 11 days from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by Mount Seir. Horeb is Mount Sinai. It is the name that in the book of Deuteronomy refers to Mount Sinai, which is near Kadesh, to Kadesh Barnea by Mount Seir. So Mount Seir, or the mountains of Seir, are a mountain range in Edom, which is on the other side of the Dead Sea. That area, just before the people are going to enter the promised land. And it says that that journey that they took from Sinai to this point where Moses is speaking to them and where they're going to enter the promised land is 11 days. That's what it should have taken. It should have taken, they get the Torah on Mount Sinai. God says, okay, 11 days later, they will be where Moses is. But it actually takes 38 years. Because this will be said on the 40th year. Right? 40 years, they wandered in the wilderness. You know the story of the scouts, but we're going to read it again in the book of Deuteronomy. And one of the things we're going to see is how the story in Deuteronomy, as in several places, differs from the way it is described earlier in the book of Exodus or in the book of Numbers. Right? But the emphasis here, I think, is Moses is telling them, hey, should have been here 38 years ago, but it didn't work out that way. And by extension, it's your fault. You messed up, right? And there's a kind of warning, right? You messed up. You didn't believe in God. You didn't trust God. And therefore, this 11-day journey has taken 38 years. Okay, so, and now we get told about exactly when Moses gives this speech. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses addresses the Israelites in accordance with the instructions that the Lord had given him for them. So, what Moses is telling them, according to this preamble, is he's sharing with them or reminding them of everything that God has given to him, that he feels he needs to give to them. And it is kihol asher tziva, everything, right? And when is this that they're standing there? In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month. It is after he had defeated, that is, God had defeated Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and King Og of Bashan, who dwelled in Ashtaroth Edrei. Okay, so these two battles, which you probably remember, those who studied with me the previous book, the book of Numbers, are big and important battles, and they resound, really. And they are the experience of these people. Right? The people that Moses is speaking to, this is the experience that they have come through most recently. And they won. This is meant, I think, in part as a sort of encouragement to the people. Look what God did for you. Look how you conquered this very mighty, these mighty peoples, right? Not to worry. You're going to go into the promised land. You're going to fight against the Amalekites. You're going to conquer the land. God is going to be with you. You can see that God was with you. You can see that with God on your side, nothing is impossible. Okay? So I wanted to just, I want to find something just to give you a sense of, let me just go to, hold on. Why am I not seeing this? Oh. Yeah, that's where it would be. Yeah, please bear with me. I'm almost there. All right, I don't see it. So let me just tell you. After the incident of the scouts, right, we get a Haftorah. And that Haftorah is about, takes place during the time of the actual entrance into the promised land, right? Under Joshua's rule. And Joshua sends in some scouts there, and they encounter, they go to Jericho, where they come into the gate, and there is a woman named Rachav, who is a prostitute who works there, and she takes them into her house, and she tells them, you know, we are afraid. The people in Jericho are afraid because we know about your battles with Og, and we know what happened, right? So there is a sense that these battles with the Amorites and with Sihon and with Og were known everywhere. These were huge victories. Okay, so then we wind up this preamble. On the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this teaching. So this is the intro. Now we know where we are, we know when we are, and we're about to speak, we're about to hear Moses's words. Oh, one more thing, I'm sorry. So it says teaching, but if you look at the Hebrew, Be'ever HaYordain, Be'eretz Moab, Ho'il Moshe Be'er et HaTorah, that Moses explained or expounded upon Torah. Right? The word Torah really means teaching. We think of the 5 books of Moses as the Torah, but the word Torah is used in a variety of ways through the Chumash. And it, for example, you'll see something that just says, this is the Torah of a person who becomes impure, right? And these are the instructions. These are the laws concerning that. right? So the word Torah, when it says Moses undertook to expound the teaching, what it's really saying is not Torah. It comes from the root hora'ah, which means teaching. Moses is teaching, and the idea of expounding here, be'er, means it really has a sense of clarifying. Moses is going to talk about the laws. He's going to talk about the experience of Israel, and he's going to clarify. He's going to make it clear what they really mean, what the history really has to teach, all of that. And now Moses begins. The Lord spoke to us at Horeb, that is Mount Sinai, saying, Rav lechem shevet bahar hazeh. You have stayed long enough at this mountain. Now, Rav lechem, you have stayed long. These are words of criticism. Like, why are you hanging around here? Get going. Right? And that's striking, of course, because, they're there receiving Torah. Why wouldn't they hang around? Right? But God is impatient here. To give you a parallel, when Korach in the book of Numbers challenges Moses, he says, Rav lecha, you've taken more than you deserve, right? There's critique. So here God says, get going. What are you hanging out here, right? He says, Panu tzu'u lachem, get going, start out, make your way to the hill country of the Amorites. So the hill country of the Amorites are the central mountains in Israel. To all their neighbors in the Arava, which is the south, the hill country, the Shfeilah, the Negev, the seacoast, the land of the Canaanites, and Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. And here we're talking about the branch of the Euphrates, which is just north of Lebanon in what is today Syria. So he's describing the land. God is telling Moses, telling the people as Moses is reminding them that you should get going, and I place the whole land at your disposal. This is for you. I'm giving it to you. Go take possession, right? So God says, it's yours. Go take it, right? And of course, taking it is not easy because there are people living there. And they're going to have to fight their way in. They're entitled to it. They have the deed, as it were, but it's not that easy. They're not going to just walk in. Take possession of the land that the Lord swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to assign to them and to their heirs after them. So here we're reminded of the covenant that God made, going all the way back to Abraham, where God said to Abraham, Lech lecha me'artzecha, leave your land, your native land, and go to the place that I will show you. And then God says, and I will give you this land for you and your ancestors. Now, in the time of Abraham, when God gives him the land, God says, well, actually, you'll go there, but you can't quite inherit it. You can't take it now. Why? Because the sin of the Amorites has not become so sufficiently great that I can kick them out. It's a really interesting statement back in the book of Genesis. In other words, on a certain level, God can give land to whoever God wants. In fact, if you look at the first comment of Rashi on the Torah, Rashi asks an interesting question. He says, why does the Torah begin with the creation of the world? Why not begin, with the beginnings of the Jewish people? Why not begin with the first law if it's really a book of laws? And so Rashi, quoting an earlier statement, says, it's there to show that since God created the world, God can give any part of it to whoever God wants to give it. Right? And in this case, of course, we read that God gave it to Abraham and then reaffirmed it in terms of Isaac, and then reaffirmed it in terms of Jacob. So it's yours. You have the deed, but you have to go in to conquer it. All right. Now, then Moses says, and here we're going to get the first piece of history. Moses is going to recount selectively a few episodes in the life of the Jewish people. And it's interesting, he starts here. Now, therefore I said to you is in itself an interesting statement, because we're going back now to Mount Sinai and to Moses talking to the people. But those are not the same people he's talking to now, right? Those are the ancestors, well, the parents really, of the generation that Moses is speaking to, right? Because the first generation, the generation from Sinai, with two exceptions, only two, and Moses, of course, have died out. They're gone. It's their children who are entering the land, and yet Moses says, I said to you, when he really means the grandparents, right? There is a sense that the people of Israel are a unit, and that unit transcends time. If I speak to the children, I'm speaking to the parents as well, right? The Jewish people stretches through time, but it is the same people. Okay, we're about to see this recounting of the history, the first incident. Before we do, I'm going to change the view. And I want to give you an opportunity, if you have a question about any of this beginning, please. Any questions about what Moses is about to do, where he is, how he remembers the past, anything at all? Okay, if not, let's dig in. And we're back to me. Okay, so they were at Sinai. Thereupon I said to you, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. The Lord your God has multiplied you until you are today as numerous as the stars in the sky. May the Lord of your ancestors, your fathers, increase your numbers 1,000-fold and bless you. But how can I, this is saying this back at Sinai, how can I bear unaided the trouble of you and the burden and the bickering? Okay. So Moses is now telling the people back at Sinai, it was too much for him. And we're going to read about how Moses now appoints a series of leaders who are going to share this burden with him. In order to look at this, we have to look back. We have to look back to what happened at Sinai. We're going to look back to the account there, and then we're going to compare it to what we have here. Moses is reminding them of something or telling them about something, but what he's telling them doesn't seem to accord to what actually happened. Now, there are two ways of looking at that. One way would be to say, well, these are different sources, right? The Torah is put together, different sources. So we have two different accounts of the same thing, and you would expect that, and we don't need to harmonize them. And that may well be true. But I want to suggest something else, and that is that Moses is selectively recasting history, that he has a message that he wants to give the people, and in order to reinforce that message, he's remembering something, but in a particular way. So there are actually, in addition to this, two other points where Moses appoints now people to aid him. We're going to look at both of them, the first one very briefly, and then the other one, which is the closest to what we have here in Deuteronomy, at more length. I'm going to ask you to turn back to page 829. And if you don't have the Eitz Chaim, turn back to Numbers. We're going to be looking at chapter 11, verse 11. Numbers 11:11. You probably, those who were with me last year, may remember because we studied this together. So here in Numbers 11:11, Moses is at the end of his rope. The people are complaining about the manna in the wilderness, and Moses says, why have you dealt ill with your servant, that is me, and why have I not enjoyed your favor, that you have laid the burden of this people on me? Did I conceive this people? Did I bear them, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries an infant to the land that you have promised on oath to their fathers? Where am I going to get meat? They're sick of the manna, they want meat. Where am I going to get meat to give this people while they whine before me, saying, give us meat? I cannot carry this people by myself. It's too much for me. And then the Lord says, gather for me 70 of Israel's elders, of whom you have experience as elders and officers. Bring them to the tent of meeting, take them and take their place there with you. And I'll come down and speak to you, and I will draw upon the spirit that is on you and putting it on them. They shall share the burden of the people, and you will not bear it alone. So in the book of Numbers, we have a scene. Moses is worn out. He's fed up. He actually says, I'd rather die if I have to do this by myself. God says, okay. And what we have here is this transfer of Moses's prophetic spirit, right? People begin to prophesy in tongues. There's a whole kind of mystical event, and they are charged up with Moses's spirit. And that's how Moses's burnout is described, and how God responds to it in the book of Numbers. That's nothing like what we're going to see in the book of Deuteronomy. What we are going to see, though, looks a lot like what we see back in Exodus. And so what I want to ask you to now do is to turn back, if you have Eitz Chaim, to page 434. 434. Exodus 18, and it's verse 13. And what we have here is Moses at Sinai. They have come through, they have made the Exodus, they've come to Sinai. And Moses's father-in-law, Yitro or Jethro, comes out now with his wife and his children. And he comes and he brings them together. He says, hey, I'm your father-in-law, here's your family. And there is this family reunion. And Jethro had not only been Moses's father-in-law, he had been kind of a mentor to him. And now he's rejoined them, and they had a little celebration. And then it says, verse 13, page 434. The next day, Moses sat as a magistrate among the people, while the people stood about Moses from morning till evening. But Moses' father-in-law saw how much he had to do for the people. He said, what are you doing with this people? Why do you act alone? All the people stand about you from morning till evening. And Moses said to his father-in-law, they come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, it comes before me. I decide between one person and another. I make known the laws and teachings of God. Okay, so what do we see there? We see Moses as a judge, right? Because he led them out. He's the leader. There are disputes. There are a lot of people. They have all kinds of disputes. They're coming to him, and he's judging case after case after case. And his father-in-law says, this is not good. You should not be doing this. He says to him, what you're doing is not right. You're going to wear yourself out, and you're going to wear the people out, right? Because they have to wait maybe days before they get a judgment. It's not working, he says. The task is too heavy. You can't do it alone. Listen to me. I'll give you counsel, and God be with you. You represent the people before God. You bring disputes to God and enjoin upon them the laws and teachings. Make known to them the way are they to go and the practices they follow. So he says, yes, teach the people about God. Teach them everything they're supposed to do. That's your job. He says, but also seek out from among the people capable men who fear God, trustworthy men, who spurn ill-gotten gain, set them over the chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, tens, and let them judge the people at all times. Have them bring every major dispute to you, but let them decide every minor dispute themselves. Or make it easier for yourself by letting them share the burden with you. If you do this, and God commands you, you will be able to bear up, and the people too will go home unwearied. So, whose idea is this? It's Jethro's, right? He tells Moses what to do, and it's all about judging, right? That's what this is here for. You're wearing yourself out, you're settling disputes, it's all about that. We don't have a sense that people are angry with Moses or challenging him. We don't have any of that here. But it could go to that, says Jethro, if you don't do something now. This is a preemptive change, not just for Moses's well-being, but for the people's well-being. And the idea here is you give them the law and let them apply the law to various cases that come before you. You tell them, do not steal. And then if someone comes and they say, he stole from me, okay, now it's up to them to interview the parties, to figure out what's going on, and to render judgment. But there will be, says Jethro, certain cases where there aren't precedents, where they won't know what to do. They'll bring them to you, and then you'll be able to handle. So Moses is like an appellate court, or he's going to deal with things that they can't deal with. And we see in the narrative, and you saw, if you were with me last year in the book of Numbers, that there are places like that. So you'll have the daughters of Zelophehad who will come and they will say, why shouldn't we inherit just because we're daughters? Our father had no sons. We want a portion in the land. And Moses, that's the kind of case that a lower judge couldn't decide. So Moses goes and asks God. And in the big case, the unprecedented case, which is going to change things, it becomes his role, and God is the one who will give the answer through Moses. Moses heeds his father-in-law, and he picks these people, and then he said goodbye to his father-in-law who left. Right? So his father-in-law said, if God approves, but actually we don't have anything here where Moses asks God, just seems to get it. And he does what his father-in-law tells him to do. And he does it because of the potential of himself being worn out and the people being worn out. Okay. Now we're going to look at a different account of this story. And this is the one that Moses shares with the people at the very beginning of Exodus. So please turn back now to our text. And we're going to pick up We are on chapter 1 again. We're going to pick up with verse 9. Thereupon, back at Sinai, I said, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. So where's Jethro? Right? Moses wasn't complaining. Moses didn't say back in Exodus, I can't bear it. Jethro says, hey, man, you're going to wear yourself out and wear the people out, right? And now why? Well, the Lord your God has multiplied you until you are today as numerous as the stars in the sky, right? So here it is, there are too many of you. It's too much for me, which is a good thing, right? In fact, may the Lord your God of your fathers increase your numbers 1,000-fold and bless you as he promised, right? So it's good that there are so many of you, right? But it's too much for me, my idea, too much for me. How can I bear unaided, and now listen to this, the trouble of you, the burden and the bickering, right? So now this is not about it's too much. And by the way, there's nothing here about this being about settling legal disputes. Not about that, at least not yet. Right? It's simply, there are too many of you and I just can't bear it. All your complaints and your trouble and your bickering. We didn't see that in Exodus. That happens later. In the wilderness, that's where they're complaining there's no manna, that the manna is dull and boring, and we want meat. And where's the water? We need water, and all of it, right? And why did you bring us into this wilderness? And better we had died in Egypt. What kind of a leader are you? You've taken everything on, all the power to yourself. Right? We're all holy people, right? All of that doesn't come at Sinai. It comes later. So why is Moses talking about that when he's talking about what happened back at Sinai? And what he's saying is so different from what we read in the book of Exodus, okay? And then Moses says, pick from each of your tribes men who are wise, discerning, and experienced, and I will appoint them as your heads. So who's choosing? The people are choosing. Back in Exodus, who was choosing? Moses was choosing, and then the people back in Exodus seem to have accepted it. You answered me and said, what you propose to do is good. So then I took your tribal leaders, wise and experienced men, and appointed them heads over you. So you picked, and then I appointed, right? But I didn't just pick, you picked. Chiefs of thousands, chiefs of hundreds, chiefs of 50s, chiefs of tens, and officials for your tribe. And I charged the magistrates as follows. So here we have a difference between chiefs and magistrates, right? It's the magistrates, he says, hear out your fellow man and decide justly between a man and fellow Israelite or a stranger. You shall not be partial in judgment, hear out low and high alike. Fear no man, for judgment is God's. Any matter that is too difficult, you'll bring to me and I will hear. Thus, I instructed you at that time about various things you should do, right? So look how different this is, right? It's the magistrates he's talking to, not the leaders. He does appoint the leaders. Now, why are the leaders different at this time? Well, the people are going to go into the land, and they need leaders to help them as an army entering the land. This is about military leadership and also about magistrates and also about judges. We see, in fact, instruction here to the judges, which is not anything that we heard about in the book of Exodus. The instruction to the judges, in fact, sounds a lot like laws that we read back in the book of Exodus, but not in this context. And let's look at the instruction. Hear out your fellow men, so you should listen. Shamoah, listen, like Shema, hear, right? So hold a hearing where you will listen carefully and ushvatem tzedek, and do judge justly, right? Tzedek tirdof, we saw earlier, justice you shall pursue. So your charge is to hear and to give just rulings, bein ish uvein achiv, between one man and his brother. Right? Striking here, Moses does not say what we might expect between a man and his fellow man. Moses is emphasizing here, and we'll see this throughout the book of Deuteronomy, that they are family, that this people is one big family, right? Between a man and his brother, and also uvein gero, and also with the stranger. So we have to have a just judgment, not just between Israelites, but also if there are non-Israelites among them, they have to get equal justice. And we see this also earlier. We've seen it a number of times, this concern for the stranger, and it's really quite radical here, right? If you have an Israelite, one of your brothers, and there's also a non-Israelite, a stranger, you don't automatically give the verdict to the Israelite. They're equal, right? And you have to do justice. And now we're told, below hikiru panim, you should not be partial, and you shouldn't be partial in judgment. You hear out high and low alike, right? So we're getting real judicial instruction. This sort of instruction we saw earlier, and now we're seeing it. And we're going to also see a little bit later in much more detail, the book of Numbers. And what do we have here? So, and if he says, don't fear any person, for judgment is God's. So you can read this a number of ways. You could say, don't let them intimidate you, right? Because God is the judge and you are working for God, and therefore you will be protected. Or you could read it, since judgment is God's, if you are partial to someone and don't judge fairly, God will hold you accountable. Right? You're not just doing what you should do. You're not just fulfilling an office. You're actually, doing God's work here, and God will hold you accountable. Okay, in a minute, and we have very few minutes left. Well, you know what we're going to do, because we really don't have much time. I'm going to open it up for questions here, both on this and both on the text in Exodus. And next week, we're going to begin by talking about why Moses seems to have recast these events so dramatically. So let me open to this gallery view. Hi, everybody, and let's go with questions. Barbara, you're first.
Yes, you mentioned that there was no bickering until after Sinai, but they actually were bickering right after.
Yes, you're right. And as I said, that
pots about the water, and that was the first time that Moses, struck.
Yeah, there was a little bit.
So what's going on? When I give a Devar, I was called this correction that's been going on. So it actually started like right away.
Yeah, it does start right away. But I still would maintain that this idea I can't bear it, we don't see earlier. Moses does, the people want water, and he says to God, they want, and he makes the water, and they're hungry, and he talks to God, and the manna falls down. So you have a little of it. You have people saying we would have been better if we died in Egypt. You have a little of that. But the real stuff that's wearing away Moses, we don't see evidence of that until well after Sinai. But thank you for pointing that out. You're absolutely right. Okay. Yes, Saul.
Yeah, it's interesting that in Bahalotacha, in the book of Numbers that you mentioned before, there was no attribution at all or no mention of poor Yitro.
Yes, there isn't mention of Yitro there. There isn't mention of Yitro in Deuteronomy, right? Absent. In the other, there's another difference, right? There's no appointment. These are simply the existing elders of the people, and they're not over thousands and 10,000s and all that, right? There's 70 of them, right? And they don't seem to be judges exactly, right? There's no talk about how you'll judge the people, and whatever is too difficult for you, you'll bring to me. We don't see any of that. What we see is this conveying of the spirit that Moses had, sharing it among the people. It seems like an entirely different story. Really very, very different. It's about charismatic leadership. It's not, well, there are too many people, and how am I going to judge them, right? And that's why, and we could talk about that. But I really want to dwell on the difference between Exodus and Deuteronomy, because those stories are so similar in some ways that you really have to ask, why is Moses doing this? Why is he? And again, you could say, just two different traditions, right? That it's legitimate to say that. It's legitimate, and that's, of course, what the source critics would tell you. But I think there's more going on. So I'll come back to that. Other questions or comments? Sandy.
So Rabbi, in verse 16, when it refers to the stranger that is with him, is that referring to the mixed multitude that left Egypt?
Yeah, I think so. Although, we are told that, it's a kind of jailbreak from Egypt, and not just the Israelites go. There are others who identified with them, who perhaps put the blood on their doorposts, right? And they come out also. So yes, I think it's a reference to that. But there's also, I would suggest, we'll talk about this a little next, there's also a projecting into the future, right? So there'll be other strangers among the people. And this is about, the language here is don't show favor and treat. And we're also going to see similar concerns about the Levite and about the poor, right? Don't show favor to those who, have the least status, the least power, right? All of that. Good. Other questions? Anything else? Barry.
Yes,
Get the last word.
yes, one of the differences is also the time at which, literally it's describing the same time as Sinai, but here Moses is speaking at the end of the 40 years, and the Israelite society has become much more complex, presumably. At Sinai, it was more about survival in the desert, where here, and over 40 years, there are more people, but there's probably more social structure, the problems have gotten more complex.
Yes, okay, so we'll come back to that a little bit next time. You're right, Moses is talking now, actually 38, because they're in Sinai. They're at the mountain for a while. But Moses is claiming this is what happened then.
Right.
Right.
I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah,
That's clearly
what,
different.
right.
Yeah.
That's what I want to think about together with you next time. Okay, So next week, we'll meet at the same time in the same place. I hope you'll come back and invite your friends also. I also hope that you'll take a listen to my podcasts. We have another one that's going to drop in the next week. I'll be talking about politics and the pulpit. So what does it mean to be a rabbi or a priest or a minister and deal with politics? So you might find that interesting. You'll find all the links to my podcast. I'm going to be sending you an email today or tomorrow with the recording. All the links are there. Figure out whether it's Google or it's Apple or Spotify, whatever you want. Click on the link and you'll find, I think we've done 4 or 5 of them, and this one will come out in the next day or 2. Okay, everybody, see you next week. I'll be sending out the recording today or tomorrow. Take care. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so
Good,
much.
so-